Hello, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And we're really delighted today to be joined by David Callahan, who is the founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy, an online and digital publication that covers the world of philanthropy in a really creative and comprehensive way. Let me tell you a little bit about David. He's from Westchester County outside of New York City, has an undergraduate degree from Hampshire College and a PhD from Princeton. He's had a really terrific career in the world of think tanks and journalism, worked at the Century Foundation, was managing editor of American Prospect, helped create Demos, a very important think tank, and worked there for about a dozen years and done really important work there. And then for the last about 10, 11 years, he's been the founder and managing editor of Inside Philanthropy. He's a prolific book writer. He's written 9 books, I think, by the count I have, and has written some really penetrating and interesting stories about the world of philanthropy and even more broadly, the political and cultural moment that we are at right now. So we really look forward to a terrific conversation. David is joining us from Santa Monica, California. I was thinking I saw the Pacific Ocean in the background, but he told me it's in the other direction, but still within sight. So David, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks.
David, as I read about your career, I was struck by your sort of your background in education. At one point, maybe you were being a little self-deprecating. You said, "I was only interested in English and history, and I nearly flunked everything else." Um, let's talk a little bit about just sort of your love of history, political science, writing, journalism, and so forth. Was that something that sort of
Yeah.
developed at an early age?
Well, I like to say I went into the family business because my father was the founder of a think tank called the Hastings Center, which helped create the field of bioethics starting in the 1970s. And my mother was a PhD and college professor in psychology, both wrote a lot of books. So it seemed natural to write books growing up. That's what adults did. And it also seemed like a great business to be in, the business of ideas and doing intellectual work and scholarship and having a life of purpose in that way. So I am the youngest of 6 kids and really the only kid who followed in my parents' footsteps.
Well, I'm the second oldest of 6, so we'll have to compare notes about being from families of 6. But David, talk about Hampshire College. I mean, it has a reputation of being just a very, pardon me, a very creative, innovative school. I know you did a lot of work in political science and history. In fact, I think your senior thesis became the basis, a thesis on Paul Nitze, an important Cold War figure, became the basis of your first book. Talk a little bit about Hampshire College and how it shaped you.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I was a terrible high school student and flunked out in many subjects, and particularly math and science. So I was really not able to get into many colleges, and Hampshire was one that accepted me and had very few requirements, which was very attractive to me. And it also really allowed students to do what they wanted, to shape their own major and to get started early on, in my case, in a big senior thesis project, which I worked on actually for 2 years while at college, and was my first book, looking at Paul Nitze, who was a top strategist of the Cold War, and using his career as a kind of prism to understand post-Cold, U.S. Cold War policy and the arms race and the development of nuclear strategy and all of that.
When you went to Princeton for your doctorate, what was your particular area? Were you following up on the sort of the Cold War era? And also, I mean, I thought I read in an interview where you said that that it was a very rigorous, interesting environment, but you never really expected to spend your career in academics. Is that right?
Right. I went to Princeton to get a PhD in order to be smarter, be able to think more theoretically. And also, I used to joke I wanted to not have to work twice as hard to prove I was just as smart, it's very helpful to have a PhD in life, as it turns out. And at that time, I was continued to be focused on US foreign policy and wrote my dissertation in that area, and also during around the same period wrote 2 more books focused on foreign policy, including one on U.S. policy toward ethnic conflicts, looking at Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Bosnia, those sorts of situations where the United States was faced with very complicated choices, diplomatically and also morally.
So when you started out, I think in the think tank world, your first placement was what's now called the Century Foundation. And as I read your bio, you were focused largely on foreign policy, but then there was sort of a pivotal moment in 1994. The Gingrich Revolution sort of swept Republicans into power after 40 years in the desert. And you were intrigued, I guess, by that, but particularly you were intrigued by the kind of conservative intellectual movement behind him that kind of propelled the Gingrich Revolution. Talk about that sort of shift in your kind of career focus from foreign policy to just being kind of captivated by philanthropy and the world of ideas as it infected domestic
Right.
politics.
Well, as people remember, who were politically active during that period in the mid 1990s, Gingrich and this conservative revolution seemed to spring out of nowhere. But if you look more closely at the intellectual institutions behind Gingrich, the policy ideas, the media institutions, you realize that conservatives had actually been investing very intentionally and strategically over many years in ideas and in think tanks and in intellectual journals. And I became very interested in this question of, why is it that the right is doing such a great job in the war of ideas, and that liberal philanthropy, despite often having much greater resources, a place like the Ford Foundation, famous social justice grant maker, one of the largest foundations in America. Why is it that the left had not done a better job of competing in the war of ideas and making the investments they needed in think tanks? And so that got me very interested in creating a think tank, which became Demos, which a project I got involved with in 1999. It was incubated by the Nathan Cummings Foundation and a leader there named Charlie Halprin.
And you were there for in a number of different capacities for 12, 13 years. I mean, what are your sort of central takeaways from that period in your professional career?
Well, Demos was focused on two major issues: political inequality and, the disproportionate way in which the wealthy and more affluent have a more voice in our society, and also economic inequality, and looking at the intersections between those two. And, one of the things you learn at a think tank is that it's very hard to move ideas forward. This is long-term work, and also can be very hard to get funding, because liberal foundations, in contrast to conservative funders, are often reluctant to invest in ideas and in think tanks. And so, at Demos, we did pretty well, but we were always scrambling to raise the funds for work. And and that's one of the things that really got me interested in the subject of philanthropy. Not only is philanthropy a very powerful force in America for shaping whose voices get amplified and what kind of ideas get elevated, uh, but there's a lot of people who are seeking funding who are very puzzled and mystified by exactly what's going on in these foundations, who these major donors are, like who these billionaires in Silicon Valley are, how do we get the money? And so that, Inside Philanthropy really looks at both sides of that coin. It looks at the power of philanthropy in our democracy, and it also helps people raise money.
Well, I want to dial down on Inside Philanthropy in just a second. But I want to touch on a couple of your books just briefly because they all looked interesting, but a couple jumped out at me. One is the book called Kindred Spirits, which is about the Harvard Business School's class of 1949. And I guess this was to me, as I read about it, kind of a fascinating new angle on sort of the greatest generation and kind of the ethos they had. So talk a little bit about that book, if you would, David.
Yeah, the Harvard Business School class of 1949 was this famous group of graduates of Harvard Business School who came out into this post-war boom and just had these amazing careers in lots of different sectors of, consumer products, finance, media and television, pharmaceuticals. And looking at the class of 1949 was really a way to tell the story of like the development of business and the ethos of business during this post-war era, which was known as a comparatively egalitarian time. This is not an era where you had these CEOs paying themselves these huge sums of money and flying around in private jets. And around the time I was finishing that book and I was having conversations with these business leaders who were now in their 70s and mostly retired, the Enron scandal happened and WorldCom collapsed and a number of other corporate scandals erupted into the news. This was the early 2000s. And I asked them, these guys, what is going on with corporate America? Why is it that there's so much cheating at the very highest levels of big business? And what they said is that culture had really changed, that greed as a kind of ethos and a legitimate idea. Greed is good, famously in Gordon Gekko's words from the movie Wall Street, that this had become more okay in corporate America. And that those conversations really got me started on my next book, The Cheating Culture, which examined corporate scandals and other ethics problems in American society.
Well, I want to touch on your one foray into fiction, which was a book that you wrote in 1997 called State of the Union, State of Union. And in an interview, you described it this way. You described it as a political thriller about this. Again, it was written in 1997, so 4 years before 9/11. It's a
Right.
political thriller about a populist billionaire president who tries to seize absolute power by staging a terrorist attack by Islamic terrorists by flying explosive planes into buildings. As you're describing it, your interviewer said, "Oh gosh, what year did you write this?" So talk about the genesis of that book. How did you that conceit seep into your consciousness?
Well, I thought it would be a lot of fun to try to write a political thriller. And I was also mindful of the kind of influence that Tom Clancy had as a kind of right-wing political thriller writer in the 80s and 90s. And so it seemed like both fun and potentially influential. So I wrote a kind of left-wing political thriller. And yes, the plot turned out to be prescient in a couple of ways. Obviously we had 9/11 a couple of years later, where real terrorists did fly planes into buildings. And then, now we have a populist president engaged in authoritarian effort to aggregate power. So it, I guess now I'm afraid to ever write another political thriller, right?
Well, David, when I first encountered your work, it was through the book The Givers. The subtitle is Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. This came out in 2017. And talk about the broad themes. I mean, I learned so much about the world of philanthropy, the sort of role it is taking as government recedes, its important mission to look into the future, and also some of the tensions between the kind of established foundations and this rising group of billionaires, both left and right, who have their own resources to fund their own ideas. So, to give us a little primer on the givers.
The big story of philanthropy in the last 10 years has been the arrival of a lot of new billionaire donors onto the scene. So when I was first trying to raise money for demos back in the late 1990s, if you wanted to get something funded, you went to a host of pretty well-known established legacy foundations. These are foundations like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Ford and MacArthur that had been established by now long dead, business titans. and they were mainly the only game in town. And now there's a whole bunch of new players on the scene who've come out of tech, who've come out of finance, who've come out of uh, real estate and many other sectors. There's about 1,100 billionaires in America, and many of them engage in philanthropy. And The Givers is really an effort to look at how dramatically philanthropy has changed as you've had all these new deep-pocketed mega donors arrive on the scene, and looks at how they wield influence in our lives and in our democracy in ways that a lot of Americans don't understand. We talked a little bit about how philanthropy can play a big role by investing in think tanks and ideas and making possible, something like the Gingrich Revolution. But philanthropy can also reshape urban landscapes by investing in parks. It can scale up major universities, can decide what gets funded by in terms of biomedical research, what kinds of arts and cultural institutions are able to win support. So there's just a lot of ways in which these donors penetrate into a US society. And my book explores all those different ways and tries to unpack some of the tensions this creates in our democracy, because we have this vision of egalitarianism in America where all of us have a kind of should have an equal say in the shaping of our society. But in fact, we're all familiar with the fact that wealthy people wield a lot of influence through campaign donations and through their corporations. Philanthropy is yet another way that the wealthy wield influence, and increasingly these living donors are the face of that, the new billionaire donors who are using their philanthropy to amplify their views, shape society according to their preferences in ways good and bad.
For people who are interested in the world of philanthropy, I really would highly recommend David's book, The Givers, and also to segue into his full-time job now as the founder and editor and really important writer for Inside Philanthropy. I know you launched it in 2014, David. Based on subscribers, largely, you have, I think, about 20 reporters from around the country. I don't think there's a single office. You're just all spread out, but just do some incredible kind of thought pieces and investigative work. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Inside Philanthropy.
As I said, I came in 2014 when I started Inside Philanthropy from kind of two different angles. On the one hand, as somebody very interested in the power of philanthropy for all the reasons I just laid out. On the other hand, somebody who had tried to raise money for 15 years and was very attuned to the frustrations that accompany grant seeking and really wanting to help create a resource that could make that easier and help people understand what's happening inside philanthropy, hence the name, right? Trying to pull back the curtain of how these people wield influence, yes, but also how they give out their money and how you as a reader can get some, right? So it is a subscription-based publication. It's expensive. It's about $400 a year. The majority of our subscribers are nonprofit grant-seeking institutions. We have a lot of foundations and philanthropists that also subscribe, and we try to cover this vast landscape of philanthropy, which is extremely complicated and highly opaque. I talked about all these new billionaire donors who've shown up. Some of them have foundations with websites and 990 tax forms that are available. Some of them operate non-transparently. So they're moving money through donor advised funds. They have LLCs as their vehicles. It's very hard to know in some cases what even some of the biggest philanthropists in the world are doing, because they're not leaving a lot of footprints behind them. Then you have these legacy foundations like Ford, which are in fact bigger and more powerful than ever. Their endowments have grown substantially with the stock market over the past 15 years. You have community foundations. There are over 800 of them around the United States. You have these funding intermediaries, which are like these middlemen in philanthropy, which play a role connecting funders and grant seekers. And so it is a varied and large landscape, and we try to cover it as effectively as we can across different issue buckets: arts and culture, healthcare, medical research, global affairs, economics, social justice. It's a lot, but it's fascinating. It's a fascinating, powerful world that most Americans don't pay enough attention to.
Well, David, you've written a couple essays in the last 6 months that have gotten a lot of attention and have been really, I think, profound and provocative. And I want to talk about one in a little bit of detail, which you wrote in March. And it was called How We Got There: 6 Reasons Liberal Philanthropy is Losing the Battle for America's Future. Um, and you drill down on what you call 6 mistakes that sort of that have shaped kind of our current political and cultural world. And I want to go through them kind of not quickly, but I want to go through them because I think they really kind of give a really vivid sense of what our political and cultural moment is. And the first one you say is underestimating the threat, and arguing that there's been a conservative agenda to dismantle or certainly sharply curtail the role of the federal government that has been in place for a number of years. And you write, you say liberal philanthropy failed abysmally to meet the moment. Most of it acted as if there wasn't an earthquake going on. This pertains particularly to the second election of Donald Trump. Play off of that theme, if you would.
As I mentioned, I've been following the conservative movement for a very long time, going back to the 1990s. I've read a lot of their documents, and I'm familiar with a lot of their ideas. And I think that they would like to dismantle a large section of the social safety net as we know it, roll back a lot of federal regulation protections, or that around water and air quality and worker safety and a lot of different things. And and I think that philanthropy has been deeply invested in creating many of those things, those accomplishments of American liberalism over the past 70 years. And they have not appreciated the extent, these foundations, to which the Trump agenda is really aiming at undoing much of what philanthropy has helped accomplish since the 1960s. And so this is sort of a profound threat to everything that philanthropy cares about and hopes to do in the future, because this administration would like to significantly curtail the possibility of more social change going forward, and really create a kind of fiscal straitjacket that will make it hard to, invest in new efforts by government to reduce inequality and what have you. And philanthropy is just not taken seriously the idea that there's this asteroid coming toward liberal America, and instead is largely continued business as usual.
Well, the second point you make is you say using a dated operating model, and you point out that philanthropy's sort of notion is identify a problem, study it carefully, assemble evidence, test hypotheses, move in a careful, methodical way, and develop evidence to shape policy. Um, and you say, but that world doesn't really exist very much anymore. You said facts matter less than narrative, which can easily be shaped by misinformation. Um, and then you say the new information juggernaut is a huge threat to reality-based community. So
Yeah.
talk about that if you would. There's an awful lot there.
Right. Well, the first foundation in America, or one of the very first foundations in America, was the Russell Sage Foundation. And it was developed to bring social science and evidence to bear on the problems facing society, particularly around inequality and the conditions of children and workers. And that sort of set the mold for a lot of elite philanthropy in coming decades. And the model of philanthropy that emerges in the mid 20th century is very much based on reason, right? That if you have the evidence behind your idea and you have tested it and piloted it, then there's a good chance you'll be able to scale it in the United States where both parties are pretty reasonable and will follow the evidence, and where our democracy is functioning and people read newspapers and pay attention to the facts. And that kind of technocratic problem solving ethos of philanthropy continues to this day. It's if you look at a place like the Carnegie Corporation or the Rockefeller Foundation or MacArthur Foundation, that's very much the ethos of these blue chip elite foundations. Meanwhile, the rest of society has changed rather dramatically, right? People don't read newspapers. There's no agreement on the facts. There's intense, deep polarization. Misinformation is rife. You don't any longer have both political parties committed to democratic norms. The Republican Party has kind of jumped the shark and embraced a kind of authoritarianism. And so it's a extremely different environment, and philanthropy has not adapted. And one area where it hasn't adapted is around, media and narrative. That it's very hard to get people to pay attention to your evidence-based policy innovation if you have no ability to shape a narrative in a world dominated by TikTok and YouTube and X and Fox News.
And the point you make related to this is that so much, I mean, Americans do not follow politics in a kind of engaged, interested way, but they absorb political information in different ways through lifestyle, through culture. And so that is kind of the critical piece to sort of getting political messages through, which is through less overt means and just kind of reasoned white papers.
Exactly, that the vast majority of Americans aren't that interested in politics or public policy. However, they are on YouTube watching Joe Rogan and channels about sports and cooking and lifestyle and a lot of different things. And the right has become very adept at moving political messages through those kind of cultural channels. And the left is still playing, and foundations in particular are still playing kind of yesterday's game of, hey, you need to get the op-ed piece in the New York Times, publish the white paper that's going to get coverage in major newspapers, and that will somehow move the agenda. And that's unfortunately no longer the way the world works.
Well, David, in your essay, you write very powerfully. You say the single biggest failure of philanthropy is its unwillingness to challenge an economic system that falls short for so many Americans. You add, this is by far the most important reason that Kamala Harris lost to Donald Trump. Talk about the economic piece, and particularly, and your article just really drilled this home, the importance of the non-college voter in American life. I mean, it's now like only about 38% of Americans have four-year degrees. So the vast majority of the electorate does not have a college education, and a lot of the kind of a lot flows from that. Pick up on that if you would, please.
Exactly. The most important issue in this election was the economy, and pretty much all groups of voters, particularly non-college voters, said that affordability and other issues of economic well-being were their top priorities. However, if you look at the infrastructure that the progressive infrastructure that philanthropy has sort of been funding and helped expand over the past decade, a lot of it has not been focused on the economy. It's been focused on climate change and LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights and racial justice and guns and a host of other issues, which are important. And many of these positions are popular. Some of them, reproductive rights is very popular. Some of them are less popular, such as defense of trans rights. But you know, the through line here is that liberal philanthropy has helped build amplify a set of voices and a set of policy groups that are not squarely focused on the top issues facing Americans. And there's a mismatch between what philanthropy funds to try to drive change and what Americans are most interested in. And so, the left doesn't have this ecosystem needed to move an economic message and bring attention to that, which really would have helped Harris in the 2024 election and could help Democrats broadly. So I see that as a major failing of philanthropy. And I explore the question of why hasn't philanthropy invested more in work to advance economic mobility? And one theory that I heard a lot of is that philanthropy is a creature of capitalism. They don't want to challenge the economic system. But another theory, which I heard a lot of when I did interviews, is that, many of the people who work in philanthropy are college educated elites who don't have firsthand experience with economic hardship. Like many college educated people on the left, they're much more interested in issues of justice and rights and the environment than they are in kitchen table issues. And that philanthropy's agenda has very much reflected who works in the sector. And of course, that's a broader critique of that we hear a lot of the Democratic Party, that is increasingly the party of college educated Americans who aren't in touch with the economic hardships of working class Americans.
David, there's been talk, I mean, in the last year or so, about the so-called abundance agenda. Sort of coming off the book that Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson wrote. Um, and I know you, in some of your writing, you make reference to the abundance agenda. Do you think that that has the potential to be sort of the foundation for the kind of um, more effective economic message, and I guess even as importantly, more importantly, set of policies that can actually get the economy working better for so many people who it isn't working for?
So after I wrote this article, How We Got Here, about the mistakes liberal philanthropy made, I wrote a follow-up article called What to Do Now, and suggesting that, you know, here's an agenda that philanthropy could invest in to try to strengthen, reconstitute American liberalism, thwart this kind of authoritarian MAGA movement. And one of the suggestions in that article was that funders needed to invest more in ideas and developing new frameworks that could maybe bust open some of the polarization that is so deep in this country and create different kinds of political coalitions. And, I cited abundance as an example of that. This is housing affordability, obviously, is maybe, top issue, the top affordability issue facing Americans. And the abundance movement has been squarely focused on that, with ideas around deregulation, which are often appealing to people on the right. So you have, on the one hand, a progressive agenda, let's make housing more affordable. And on the other hand, a kind of right wing idea, or many people associate deregulation with the right. There's a left wing history of deregulation, but it's an idea that could transcend partisan divisions. I also cite anti-monopoly work as an example of an idea that could transcend partisan divisions. There's a lot of people on the right who don't like concentrated corporate power. And obviously the left has a long history of fighting concentrated corporate power as well. So, you know, those are the kinds of ideas that philanthropy needs to invest in and Democrats need to explore to try to, get us into a different political moment.
And in that follow-up article you mentioned, you make two broad points. One, which is, in terms of the perspective of what should liberal philanthropy do. The first is to find ways to slow down what is occurring here, to stop it, to try to really regain power in 2026, winning back the House, and also critically making gains in state and local politics, which is where this sort of infrastructure of a new kind of economics and politics could be, and then also to craft a long-term vision for the future
Yeah.
that is compelling. So talk about those two elements, how those things proceed.
Right. There is, and again, I'm framing everything through the lens of philanthropy because that's what I write about. But in suggesting how donors on the left could deploy their resources, uh, I make sort of a short-term and long-term set of suggestions. In the short term, the goal is when take back the House in the 2026 midterms, do well in the states, help shift public opinion to against Trump policies by kind of illustrating and showing people how they're hurting ordinary Americans, including people in rural areas and a lot of Trump's base that's going to be hard hit by cuts to food assistance and Medicaid, laying the groundwork for the Democrats taking back the White House in 2028 and starting to repair some of this damage. But that doesn't address the longer term challenge that the left of center coalition has, which is that it's hemorrhaging working class voters now of all races, and that a lot of non-whites, Latinos, Asian Americans, blacks, who Democrats really took for granted, who thought we're always going to be voting as this kind of reliable Democratic bloc. It's now clear that that is not going to be the case going forward. That if you, particularly as you have Latinos and Asian Americans getting further away from the immigrant experience. They're assimilating into the mainstream. They're moving to the suburbs. Many of them are moving up the economic ladder. They're increasingly voting like the rest of Americans, which is not overwhelmingly Democratic, right? And so Democrats have lost vote share with non-whites in the last couple elections, and that trend is likely to continue. So the question is, well, why is that happening, and what do you do about it? And what are these, what are these voters most concerned about? And again, that leads us back to the affordability and the economic issues, because for many of those voters, moving up and having an affordable life is the principal thing that they want help from our political system.
Well, we've been talking about liberal philanthropy. What has been the role of conservative philanthropy in bolstering this MAGA movement?
Well, a lot of the ideas that are in Project 2025, which has served as a kind of blueprint for this administration, have been under development in conservative think tanks for decades. And the Heritage Foundation itself, which put together Project 2025, is a $90 million a year think tank, which has been one of the crown jewels of conservative philanthropy, started in the 1970s, funded heavily by conservative donors who have just reliably made large donations to the Heritage Foundation, making it one of the most effective think tanks in American history. And meanwhile, there's a whole new set of kind of America First type MAGA institutions that have emerged that have been funded by philanthropy. And so, yeah, I mean, this is a yet one more example of the role that private money, tax deductible, charitable dollars plays in shaping American policy and politics.
You have talked. I saw a couple interviews where you were asked, how you muster hope, and you recall your studies in American history, and you're saying that you've studied a fair amount of dark periods in American history, and you've seen moments when, the wheel is turned and better impulses prevail. And in an interview I saw recently, you were talking particularly about the progressive movement in the early 1900s and how that emerged from a really difficult time with kind of predatory capitalism and so forth. So, I mean, as you look at, say, the progressive movement at that time, I mean, what are the central themes you would draw from that could be applicable to liberal philanthropy and others to just to kind of get a more balanced politics?
Well, if you do look back to the early 1900s, it was a very dark moment in American history. The oligarchical power was at its zenith. There was no modern social safety net. There was no right to form labor unions. The federal government was small and irrelevant. State governments were largely captured by corporate power. And there was widespread violence and suppression of protests and labor movements that was often backed up by the state. And we got out of that and created within 40 years a modern welfare state and a whole new set of regulatory institutions to protect workers and the public's health and reduce inequality. And the progressive movement was and the labor movement were key uh, pillars of that effort at national reform. And the progressive movement did had sort of really two major themes. One, to challenge corporate power, and that was embraced by Teddy Roosevelt and trust busting in the name of American freedom. The critique was not that business is bad per se or capitalism is terrible. It was that these corporate trusts were destroying Main Street and were making it hard for ordinary Americans to develop their own businesses and their own economic freedom, and that we're all sort of being slaves to these sort of oligarchical interests. And the second key theme of the progressives was that our political institutions were corrupt and had been, captured. They'd been captured by political machines in urban areas. They'd been captured by corporations at the legislative level, and that we needed political reform. And if you look around today, it's, both of those main uh, themes are very, have a lot of potential and resonance. And so I've been excited to see a kind of new modern anti-monopoly movement emerge. I think that the talk about reforming institutions and the abundance agenda certainly plays into that. Breaking up cartels and regulations that have been weaponized and for the powerful. Uh, uh, you know, there's those themes have worked before.
David, kind of a final question. We have a number of students who are watching this, and as you reflect on your career and all the things you've done, the kind of twists and turns you've taken, what advice would you give to someone starting out now who's broadly interested in public policy or public affairs in terms of, education, careers, taking risks? What would you tell your 22-year-old self who, when he put down his Paul Nitze notes and was thinking about the future, what advice would you give him?
A couple pieces of advice. First, figure out your competitive advantage and be honest to yourself about it. I have met many people trying to do things they're not really good at, particularly being writers. I get a lot of applications from people who want to be journalists, but this is like clearly not a major strength of theirs. Figure out your competitive advantage. Second, figure out what your main area of passion is. What is the issue you care most about and where you would most like to drive change because you need that inner sense of purpose and commitment to muscle through all the tough stuff in one's career. Um, Second or third, figure out like what kind of lifestyle you want. And some people imagine they want to go into politics and have a really public life, and they're not really being honest with themselves about whether they're like actually that kind of extrovert and want to spend that much time around people and be out there and doing stuff, and as opposed to have a more private life or more flexible schedule. And so I think those are really important things to keep in mind. And then I would add another, which is figure out your ego needs and how much status you want, because there's a lot of people who think they want to be a huge big shot, Time Magazine Person of the Year or U.S. Senator, but in fact, they don't really need that. And maybe they would like to have, they just want to have an impact. And then there's people who think that like they don't really need recognition, but then they get, a certain point in their career and they just feel like nobody knows who I am. I have no status in the world. So those are just some things that I have thought about a lot in the course of my career and always tell young people to think about as they look forward.
What kind of things do you like to read? Are you I know you have some pretty intense research uh aspect of your work. Do you have some time to read fiction? Do you like nonfiction, biographies? How do you like to read and educate yourself?
I like to read a lot of history and narrative nonfiction and listen to a fair number of audiobooks, when I'm doing other things. Uh, right now, in fact, I'm listening to a history of the progressive era with a lot of sort of well-etched characters telling the story of that period. I'm also reading a history of California, which is where I live, fascinating state. And that's the stuff I gravitate. And then I'll read, something that's a little more lighthearted, like a memoir of Patti Smith, the poet and rock musician. But yeah, mainly memoir, biography, history. Those are my topics.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, David, thank you for a terrific conversation. It's been really, really interesting. And again, I would recommend to viewers to read David's book, The Givers. It really provides a kind of a sharp lens on an important part of our economy and our life that is little understood. If you're brave, read his political thriller and see how someone is able to look, you know, far into the future and see what is likely to happen. But also, if you're so inclined, Inside Philanthropy, we subscribe to it at the Institute. I find it an invaluable resource for understanding the world of donors and how they think and what they're interested in. So the articles are well written, lots of interesting profiles and both individuals and institutions. So I would strongly encourage people to take a look at that if they're so inclined. So, David, thank you again so much, and look forward to following your work in the future.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And thanks to all you for watching this conversation. We will have the video on our website in the coming days. Please share it with family and friends. Thanks for supporting the Institute, keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.